Detente was an effort to sell at home that Cold War policies were not about war, that they were about peace. That we had to do the things we were doing, deploy our forces overseas, prepare for war so that we could prevent it from happening, and that the leaders in all of these countries, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, were trying to work to forestall conflict, not to create conflict.
This is Tony Williams, a senior fellow with BRI, and we are pleased to bring you the fourth episode in our Cold War and the Presidency series, and really honored for this episode to have on Jeremi Suri, who will be talking about Nixon, Kissinger, and the Cold War. In this series, our main question is how individual presidents have shaped executive powers during the Cold War. And so he'll help us answer that. And by way of introduction, Jeremi Suri holds the Mack Brown Distinguished Chair for Leadership in Global Affairs at the University of Texas at Austin, and is a professor in the university's Department of History and the LBJ School of Public Affairs. Dr. Suri is the author and editor of some 9 books on politics and foreign policy, most recently, The Impossible Presidency, The Rise and Fall of America's Highest Office. And his other books include, they're very relevant to our discussion, Henry Kissinger and the American Century, and also Liberty's Surest Guardian, American Nation Building, From the Founders to Obama. Jeremi, thank you very much for agreeing to come on the show.
My pleasure. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
All right, very good. Well, let's jump right in with our first question. In your book on Henry Kissinger, you describe how he and Nixon faced, but also importantly, helped to shape a fundamental redirection of the Cold War from a bipolar superpower struggle to a more complex multipolar world. You also describe how they really saw themselves as strong and decisive statesmen who would create a world with greater order, according to their view, freed from, unfortunately, maybe the usual constraints of democratic politics and also normal bureaucratic channels, diplomatic channels. What were their goals in the conduct of Cold War foreign policy?
So I think you provided a perfect introduction for thinking about Nixon and Kissinger. They come into office, the two of them, after a really difficult period in American society. This is the period of the Vietnam War, of course, and they inherit that war, a war that's not going well, where the United States has put in a great deal of resources in a faraway place. And turmoil at home over civil rights. This is not simply the moment of the civil rights movement. This is a moment also when there are deep debates and conflicts within American society over the future role of the US government with regard to various inherited racial issues and economic issues in our society. So Nixon and Kissinger really believe they need a strong, contained presidency that can pursue policy with limited interference from what they see as many of the conflicts and controversies around them. They want to forge new partnerships with allies overseas and those at home who they think will be useful for their goals. They want to show that the US government is capable again. The perception in 1968, 1969, when they come into office, is that the US government is not capable of winning wars and not capable of dealing with civil rights issues at home. They want to show that they're capable of doing this. And most of all, they want to become the agenda setters. This is really the most important point. They believe that the issues of the day have taken agency away from leaders, and that leaders, particularly the president, that the president has to be able to assert his dominance as agenda setter, as the person who sets out what the priorities for the country will be. Otherwise, they fear more violence, more chaos at home and abroad.
Great, and one of their first priorities, as you just mentioned, was, I think, the Vietnamization of the Vietnam War. And as you're mentioning, to restore that sort of tattered American credibility. And so how did they try to combine, I think as you described it in your book, the military escalation with negotiations, and oftentimes secret negotiations?
Right. So Nixon and Kissinger believed that one of the problems in Vietnam and elsewhere was that the United States had become this lumbering giant. We had all this power, all this capability, but we were letting others tell us how to use it. and we were on the defensive everywhere. The Soviets would make an advance in one area and we would respond. Ho Chi Minh would do something in Vietnam and we would respond. They wanted to reassert direction and use American power in a more focused way. And so in Vietnam, what that meant was a combination of escalation and negotiation. The escalation involved using more air power, and it meant investing in training more Vietnamese soldiers, South Vietnamese soldiers, to take up the burden of the war. And that's what Vietnamization meant. It meant that the United States would stay engaged, but it wouldn't be directly American soldiers doing this work, that we would train local surrogates. That would make it easier to sell this at home because it wouldn't be Americans dying, they claimed. But it also could be more effective if done well, because you'd have local soldiers who had more legitimacy on the ground. And American credibility would be built not on American soldiers killing Vietnamese communists, but on the Vietnamese themselves doing that work and our being the supporters of the righteous actors on the ground. So that's what Vietnamization meant. It meant actually a different kind of escalation, even as we were taking our own forces out. At the same time as Nixon and Kissinger were pushing for more air power and more South Vietnamese soldiers to be trained, they were also reaching out to the North Vietnamese through the Soviet Union and through China. And the argument they were making to the Soviets, who you would think would want to see the United States bleed in Vietnam, the argument Nixon and Kissinger made was that this war is getting out of hand. And it's now going to jeopardize Soviet interests in the region and Soviet interests in arms control and other deals with the United States. So if the Soviet Union wanted the United States to be more pliable, to be a better interlocutor, better deal maker for other areas, then the Soviet Union had to help us in Vietnam, help convince Soviet allies in North Vietnam to negotiate a deal with us. And what Nixon and Kissinger were seeking, which to some extent they were able to get in 1972, was a deal from the North Vietnamese, sponsored by the Soviets and the Chinese in part, for a de-escalation so American soldiers could withdraw and so the war could be turned over to the South Vietnamese.
Okay, great. And speaking of the Russians, Nixon and Kissinger really also contributed to the decrease in tensions with the Soviet Union in that spirit of détente. And were able to really achieve, in many ways, significant progress in the area of arms control. So why did they do it, and how were they able to achieve that success?
So this is really one of their great achievements, as you said, Tony, that the emphasis upon turning the Cold War from continued conflict and near military escalation between the United States and the Soviet Union into actually a set of rules, a set of deals that allowed for the United States to remain anti-communist and allowed for the Soviet Union to continue to exist, but made the risk of warfare and danger much less than it had been before. Nixon and Kissinger had lived through the Cuban Missile Crisis. They didn't want to relive that moment. So détente was an effort to create boundaries on what would be safe and unsafe conflict, to put guardrails on this. There would be no direct confrontation between the United States and the Soviet Union. Europe, the states of Europe that were at the center of the Cold War, there would be no effort to change those borders. There would be no effort to undermine the other side internally, right? We would no longer try to support people seeking to overthrow the Soviet regime in the Soviet Union. They would not do that at home. Conflict would continue elsewhere, though. It would be okay in the third world, as it was called at the time, in places such as the Middle East and North Africa, for there to be continued rivalry between allies of the Soviet Union and the United States. So the idea was to create certain kinds of rules, and within that then to achieve certain measures that would be in the interests of both superpowers, to reduce spending on nuclear weapons, and eventually to reduce many of those weapons, to reduce the testing of those weapons, which would create atmospheric problems, and to help one another deal with third parties, deal with actors that might instigate a conflict between the United States and the Soviet Union. And this is an important part of détente, recognizing that smaller actors often played the two sides off of one another, and trying to limit the ability for that to happen. One other element of détente that I emphasized actually in an earlier book I wrote called Power and Protest was that détente was an effort to sell at home that Cold War policies were not about war, that they were about peace. That we had to do the things we were doing, deploy our forces overseas, prepare for war so that we could prevent it from happening, and that the leaders in all of these countries, especially the United States and the Soviet Union, were trying to work to forestall conflict, not to create conflict. So that's the big difference, Tony, you see between the rhetoric of a John F. Kennedy, which is more traditional Cold War rhetoric, pay any price, bear any burden, and Nixon and Kissinger, who are talking about controlling conflict and creating rules and limits on conflict.
Okay, great. And you mentioned playing off the superpowers against each other, and probably one of the most stunning proofs of the shift of American Cold War strategy under Nixon and Kissinger in a multipolar world was that opening of China to diplomatic relations. So how do they pull this off? And what were the short and long-term effects of opening China?
It's such an important topic, especially because China is such an important topic in the contemporary world as well. So from 1949, when the communist regime comes to power in China, until 1971, 1972, the United States had no relations with the communist regime. We actually pretended it didn't exist. We said they were illegitimate, that the real representatives were in Taiwan. Nixon and Kissinger shift that, and it is one of the most decisive and important shifts during their leadership. Why do they do this? They do this, first of all, because the United States is isolated and the only country in this role. We've inherited this position. But secondly, because they recognize that China needs the United States, even the communists in China, and we need them, that we have mutual interests. And Kissinger in particular will say over and over again that mutual interests should override ideology. Interests override ideology. So it is not an apology for the communist regime, which is pursuing horrible policies in the late 60s and 70s, their so-called Cultural Revolution, but it's an act of realism to say that this regime is really important for us. The Chinese are engaged in near warfare with the Soviet Union, even though both states are communists. Mao Zedong, the leader of China, does not recognize the Soviets any longer as the father communists. And they have a long border with many disputes. It's still true today. And Kissinger and Nixon recognize that the Chinese will want American help. They also recognize that the Soviets will be motivated to help the United States if they see us moving toward the Chinese, because they will want to stop us from becoming too close to the Chinese. So this is what Nixon and Kissinger call triangular diplomacy. The other thing that they recognize, which is really interesting, is that for all the communism of Mao Zedong, he still wants recognition from the United States. There still is value in the United States telling the world that this is a legitimate country, even though the rest of the world already sees that. And by reaching out to Mao, they're able to give him something, and they can get some things in return, potentially help in Vietnam, and down the line, more trade. And there are a lot of American business groups that are keen in the 1970s, as they are today, to do business in China. And so this is an important motivation as well.
Okay, great. Last questions regarding executive power. You argue that Nixon and Kissinger distrusted normal diplomatic channels like the State Department to conduct foreign policy, and they really wanted to kind of control it out of the White House and the National Security Council, and were really willing to engage not only in secretive diplomacy, but as you write in the book, Nixon was willing to use presidential powers in whatever way he deemed necessary. So what effect does the Nixon administration's Cold War diplomacy have on the executive branch in this country?
I think one of the real problematic legacies that we're living with from the Nixon years is the growth of the White House and the president in the White House and his national security advisor as actors with less accountability than was intended in the Constitution and was intended in the National Security Act of 1947 and the practice of foreign policy before that. Presidents like Eisenhower and Kennedy and Johnson had used covert operations, but they had not conducted diplomacy in war from the White House in the same way. Nixon and Kissinger distrusted the State Department. They distrusted to some extent the Defense Department, because these were civil service professionals for the most part who were doing their job but were not always loyal to the president. They were loyal to their job over the president, which is how it's supposed to work. They wanted absolute loyalty because they were trying to do, and they believed for the right reasons, they were trying to do some things that were unorthodox, opening relations to China, as example that we just talked about. And they felt that the bureaucracy, that the checks and balances that our framers brilliantly built into our system hampered their ability to act. And this was an old complaint, right? That in a democracy, we're less flexible, we're slower because we have to go through all these legal processes. So they tried to short circuit that. The most extreme example of that was bombing Cambodia to try to interdict supply lines to South Vietnam in 1970. And not telling Congress, not telling the American public, in fact, lying. about it. This doesn't condemn the policies they were pursuing, but it points to a constitutional and an institutional problem. And Democrats and Republicans coming after Nixon and Kissinger have been too quick to use American force, and they have centralized too much power in the White House. It's important that the framers believed that the chief foreign policy person for the president was to be the Secretary of State, who would be accountable to Congress. That is a congressionally confirmed position. The NSC advisor, which is created as an administrative position in 1947, grows with Kissinger in particular into the main foreign policy position for that administration, many others, and Congress has no oversight over the NSC advisor. This is a real problem, and I think it's something we struggle with today. It's really important that we have a discussion, I think, with this history in mind, about what we think is the appropriate constitutional framework for foreign policy making. I think we've deviated from that, and I think Nixon is an important moment when that deviation becomes, I think, really, really problematic.
Jeremi, a really important conversation. Really appreciate you coming on to talk about Nixon and Kissinger in the Cold War.
Thank you for the excellent questions. I enjoyed every minute of it.
Well, a great conversation leaves you wanting more, and I definitely recommend our viewers pick up a few of your 9 books to learn more, to learn the rest of the story. Thank you again. So thank you for joining us for our mini curriculum video series on the Cold War and the presidency. Check out our other episodes on FDR, Truman, Kennedy, and Reagan, with interviews with several leading historians on this important topic. Thank you.